Oh, there's so many people here. My name is Hannah, and I'm really excited to be with you guys. I think you'll learn very quickly that I am a storyteller, never met a story that I didn't like, and so I'm just going to start off by sharing a little bit about me so that we can get comfortable with this topic of honesty. Sound good? Yeah. Okay, so 3 years ago, I went on a first date with a guy that I met on a dating app. And I decided at this point, I was just completely done with A, dating, and B, first dates. I was like, I'm done with this. I'm over the things we can say, the things we can't say, all the niceties, all the things that we reserve for the fourth date. So I was like, okay, I'm gonna flip this date on its head, and I'm just gonna go rogue on the date. Some of you are like, I would never go on a date with you for this reason. But we sit down at the table, and I basically say to him, okay, we're going to have an honesty hour. And he's like, well, what's honesty hour? And I was like, well, I just came up with the term right now. But honesty hour means that you can say whatever you want to say, because there's nothing wrong. You can say whatever. You can talk about past relationships. You can do all the things they tell you not to do on a first date. Because, I was just over the fake. I was over just putting everything out there perfectly polished and then coming to find out months later, like, oh, we probably should have just talked about that on the first date, you know? So I'm like, it's honesty hour. And at this point, I'm surprised that he didn't pick up and just walk out of the restaurant at that point. I must have done something right because we got married a year later. So he's here somewhere. I don't know where he is. But all that to say, something broke open and something beautiful really happened when we put that concept of honesty hour on the table. All of a sudden, we were vocal with one another. We were talking about things that we probably wouldn't have talked about. And we found the conversation flowing where it'd be like, oh, well, because it's honesty hour, let me just tell you this. And because it's honesty hour, let's just go here. And it really set the tone where we were on the same page with one another and we were able to move forward. And so that's how I've tried to live my life from this point moving forward, is as if this whole entire thing is one big honesty hour, because I've seen the beauty that comes from learning to be honest with one another. But I have to admit, I was so nervous for this talk all week. I was thinking about it. My friend AK texted me and he was like, hey, I'm giving the same talk in Boston. And I was like, well, what are you gonna do? And he's like, well, I'm just gonna get up there and I'm gonna be honest. And I was like, that's really genius. I should try that. I'm gonna do that. That's so good. And so if you and I were having an honesty hour right now, I would tell you, honesty hour, I moved to Atlanta 4 years ago. I knew somebody on Twitter. I thought that was a good enough reason to move. I packed up my Toyota Camry and I moved down south from Connecticut. I learned very quickly there is a big difference between the North and the South. Y'all are super sweet. Your food is so good. You were just about willing to let anybody come into your home. And in the North, we're a little bit more guarded. We have extra layers. We're like an onion. But what I learned very quickly in the South is when somebody says bless your heart, they're not being nice to you. That's like an undercut. And so what I appreciate about where I came from is that in the North, we're just blunt. We're just honest with you. If we don't like you, we will just tell you right up front, let's not play games about it. And so I like to think that I'm infusing the South with some of my honesty hours, but I generally like everyone, so I'm not gonna come up to you and be like, I don't like you. But I would tell you honesty hour that before I moved to Atlanta, I moved to New York City. And that was my dream for a really long time, to live in New York City. And when I got there, I was working for a human rights organization at the United Nations. And I found myself struggling with a lot of loneliness. And that loneliness morphed into sadness, and then that sadness morphed into what became a diagnosis of depression. But I didn't know that it was depression because no one in my family had ever talked about depression. I didn't know that it ran on both sides of my family. I didn't know that depression was something that could happen more than once. I thought it was like the chicken pox. If you have it once, it goes away forever. Turns out that's not true. that if you actually deal with depression, there's an 80% likelihood that you will deal with it again. And so I didn't know what to do with all of this sadness in a new city. And so what I started to do is I started to pick strangers out on the New York subway, and I started writing letters to them. If it sounds like it's insane, that's because it was. Thankfully, I didn't tell my parents about it. They would have been like, if you're nervous, you could just come home. Like, you don't need to write letters to all the strangers in New York City. But I found that there was something really refreshing about getting to be honest with people. And then what I would do is I would fold up the letter and I would write on the front of it, if you find this letter, it's for you. And then I would leave it somewhere in New York City. I would leave it in coffee shops, or I would leave a letter in my favorite books in Barnes & Noble, or I would tuck them in the delegate seats at the UN. Like, I was like, you need a love letter. And if some of you are thinking like, okay, love letters, I don't get it. To know me is to know that I have grown up my whole entire life with my mom writing letters to me, because my grandmother wrote letters to her. And so in every life experience that I have ever had, my mom has left letters for me all over the place. And if I moved into a college dorm room, letters were taped to the bottom of Tupperware bins. And if I come home for a weekend, there will be letters and like confetti in my bags when I come home. And my mom is somebody who doesn't write letters because she loves stationery or stamps. My mom just really understands the value of paying attention to people, making them feel known and making them feel seen in a world where it feels like sometimes we just don't have time for one another. My mom is also the most embarrassing person on the face of the planet. If you think you have an embarrassing parent, like, you should meet my mom. She's awesome. For anybody that has partied with her in the graveyard of Atlanta, the basement. She showed up with glow gloves. But my mom is the person who she carries a kazoo in her pocketbook at all times, because if there is a birthday, she needs to go and play the kazoo. And I'm not talking about like the birthday of like somebody at her table. She will leave the table and she will go join another party just to be a part of it. She is the person that, she told me this story that she, at one point, got into the elevator at her work, and everybody around her was on their cell phones. And so she pulled her Tupperware bin container out of her bag, and she just starts tapping on the Tupperware container. And people are looking at her, like, and she's going, boop, 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 boop. And they looked at her like she was crazy, like, somebody needs to get this woman off the elevator now. And I just remember her saying, and I just said to them, I'm just talking on my cell phone right now. Like, no social boundaries whatsoever. I was mortified by her growing up, but I realize now that she was teaching me something really important. She was teaching me to look people in the eye. She was teaching me to pay attention. She was teaching me that if you have somebody in front of you, then treat that person like they are the center of your universe, because you know that at some point you have wanted to feel like the center of somebody's universe. And I think as I get older, I start to realize in this digitally connected world that we need that more than ever. It's crazy to think that we are more connected than ever before, and yet I think if I did a survey of the room, we would say we're actually more disconnected. We're actually more sad. We're actually more anxious. And so sitting on those trains, I was just channeling whatever my mother had taught me. And I ended up writing a blog post about it. And I said at the end of the blog post, if you need a love letter for whatever reason, I am going to write to you. I published it and I thought, great, I am going to write 2 letters, one to my mom and one to the other person that reads my blog at this time. And the wildest thing happened. That post morphed into hundreds of emails showing up in my inbox. Some of the craziest stories that I had ever read: people being bullied, people moving to new cities, single mothers in Sacramento, struggling to love their children, people reaching out and saying like, hey, if I wrote my friend a letter, he would think it was really dumb, but I think it would be really cool if you wrote a letter and he would have no idea where it came from. And I learned in that moment that people want to talk about what's really going on behind the screen. We just have a hard time getting there. The best way that I can describe what that moment felt like is that moment in the movie The Wizard of Oz that I'm sure all of you have probably seen. where Dorothy, she goes through all the hoops to get to the point where she can get to the wizard so that she can just go home. She just wants to go home. She slays a witch, she grabs the shoes, she shows up to the wizard. And they come to find out that it's actually just a man behind the curtain that can't really do anything all or powerful for her. And that was the moment that I felt like happened to me as all of these emails started coming in and people just started being crazy honest with me. And so I use that to kind of morph what I think is my definition of honesty these days. That honest people are willing to pull back the curtain. They don't claim to have it all together. They go to work on the ground floor. And I think that that is the value of honesty, that we would be able to go to work on the ground floor with one another. I want to be careful in saying that I don't think that honesty and vulnerability are the same thing, and I think we kind of get them mixed up sometimes. We don't have to go out into the world and be like, here's all of my junk, have it, We don't have to pour it all out on social media. I think that what honesty is opening the door. I think vulnerability is having the courage to say, hey, come inside and see the mess for yourself. And so we're focusing on that opening of the door and how we can do that better in work and relationships. In my own life, I ended up writing 400 letters to strangers that year. If it sounds really romantic, it wasn't at all. But I knew at that age of 22 that if I wanted to do something in this world, I wanted to be the kind of person that followed through. I wanted to be the kind of person who made a promise and then stuck with that promise. And those 400 letters became the foundation for an organization that I run today called More Love Letters. We are a global organization. We use the power behind social media to write and mail letters to strangers in need all over the world. And so you might go on the site, you might nominate a friend, a family member, somebody going through a tough time. We would pick them, we'd put them on the website, and for a month, anyone gets a chance to handwrite a letter and send it in. They show up for a person on a day where they think, nobody's going to notice me, no one might even know my name. I could tell you so many stories about a man named Ray who had stage 4 colon cancer, and they really didn't know. They were doing rounds and rounds of chemotherapy, and they got to the last round of chemotherapy, and he told his daughter that he wanted to give up. It was his daughter that requested love letters for him. They showed up, they read the letters together, and by a miracle, I can stand up here and say that Ray is alive, and that he's cancer-free, and that there are love letters paneling the walls of his office. Or I could tell you about a man who was riddled with PTSD. He came home from serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was his sister that requested letters for him. They showed up, and several weeks later, he called her on the phone, and he said, I'm sitting on the floor, and I am crying because this one small act has restored my faith in humanity. Or I could tell you about one of my favorite stories, a woman named Leona, who after 69 years of holding the hand of her best friend, he let go. And it didn't matter how much her grandchildren's laughter filled the days. There were just days where plain and simple, she wanted her husband back. She wanted him to be alive again. And it was her granddaughter that requested letters for her. They showed up right before Christmas, and Leona sat in her favorite chair, and she read letter after letter after letter, and she got up, and she wheeled her walker into the kitchen, and she announced to the room, I am going to stick around now. I am going to read these letters each day, and I am going to stick around now. And there are so many beautiful stories we have been able to spread across all 50 states, over 70 countries, over 100 college campuses. We've sent over 250,000 letters to people all over the world. But I think the most beautiful part of the story is when I was able to invite people in. When I was able to say, this is not my thing, this is your thing. And that is where honesty comes and it shows up. And so I wanted to come and I wanted to bring some practical tips for you guys because I am a big lover of practical tips. I think inspiration is awesome, but I think that these practical action steps are what actually change us. They're the things that when we walk out of here and we go about our days, something actually looks different. And so as I go into that, I just want to be able to put this one thing up on the screen, if we can. I think that this is the premise for a lot of honesty. We have to be willing to tell one another where we are. And I think that's incredibly hard sometimes in this world of social media where it's easier to say, I'm over here and everything is good and everything is fine. But honesty starts with telling one another where we are on the map. You don't call an Uber, shut off the phone, run 5 miles down the street, and then like turn it on again. And you're like, oh, sorry, I'm actually over here 5 miles down the road. And so why do we do that with one another on a daily basis? And I can tell you that my time in Atlanta 4 years ago when I moved here, and it didn't look anything like I thought it was going to look, it started with being able to tell the people in the room that maybe I wasn't the closest with, but to be able to be honest and say to them, hey, I don't want to be here right now. I want to run. I want to go back home. I don't want to stay. And that was able to open up the door to some really beautiful things. We have to tell one another where we are because sometimes we don't even know that lives might be hanging in the balance. So here's how we insert more honesty into your work and relationships. That's really bright, so I apologize if you were like, oh, the black was really good and awesome. Okay, we're just going to go rapid fire because that's what I like. The first one, dig deep within. So this one applies to just the creative process in general because I know that there are a lot of you in this room that have a creative process. And I think about my own creative process, and I know that in order to create honest work, we have to be willing to dig deep within. And in order to dig deep within, every one of you knows that it's not a 15-minute thing. It's not like I dug once and that was done. I like to say, or if you get to know me a little bit better, maybe it would have been my 2 truths and a lie, is that I am one of those like true crime junkies. I'm not one of the true crime junkies that came on the scene in 2016. That wasn't me. Like I am like deep in the 34th page on Google. Like I am in the Reddit threads, true crime junkie. Like I could go days just trying to solve mysteries. And one of the things that I know, and that you probably all know, is that when there is a crime scene, what is the first thing that happens when a crime scene is named? The yellow tape comes out, right? And so I was Googling last night, and a lot of times when you Google things, you're like, oh, great, other people have Googled this before. Awesome. Like, that makes me feel really comfortable and sane that I'm not the only one Googling this thing. But I think yesterday might have been the first time that I was like, yeah, no, Google doesn't know where I'm going with this. But I was Googling, why do we put tape around a crime scene, which seems completely, like, obvious, but I still wanted to see if there were any scholarly articles on it. And I found this article, and I loved how it was written. It said here that we put the yellow tape around the crime scene to make sure that a crime scene's integrity is protected while a crime is investigated. To make sure a crime scene's integrity is protected while a crime is investigated. And you want to know what's another word for integrity? Honor. And you want to know what comes from the word honor? Honesty. And so within our creative process, I wonder why, if they put tape around a crime scene to make sure nothing comes in and nothing goes out, why in our creative process are we so willing to sit down and let all these things come at us? Why do we think in our creative process that it's like, okay, well, I'll just check my email during this, and I'll be on social media, and I'll do this, and I'll do this thing? We're allowing so many people to come in and get their fingerprints all over our work, that I think if we would be willing to dig deep and see what's really there, we would find our most honest work. And that would be the work that we don't have to Google, or we don't have to look and say, okay, well, that person did it, so I could do it that way. We could learn to be honest with our work, and we could put it out there. Number 2, either keep your word or tell the truth. Now, this is something that I am definitely preaching to myself. Everything that I put up here, I am preaching to myself. But I think it's incredibly easy, especially in 2018, where we make plans, and then we're like, last minute, I don't want to do that. And instead of just saying like, hey, like I don't have the energy tonight, or like I really can't make it work tonight, we come up with like this elaborate excuse as to like why we can't show up. And then we waste all of this extra energy being like, I really hope that like my excuse isn't found out, that they find out that I'm not at like, my great aunt's wake, funeral, whatever it is. I went through some things last year where I got to see the beautiful things that come from honesty and the hard things that come from dishonesty. And it morphed me into that character in that Jim Carrey plays in Liar Liar, where like I was unable to not tell the truth about things, and it was like really hard and really uncomfortable. But it also taught me that, hey, you can just either keep your word or learn to tell the truth. You don't have to come up with an excuse, because then I'd have to call the person back and be like, hey, I'm sorry, that wasn't exactly true. Here's what's really happening. And integrity is really hard to get back the second time around. Or we could be people that learn to say, hey, I don't want to do this thing, but I said that I would do this thing, and so I'm going to show up regardless of my feelings. That we could be people that would allow our yes to mean yes and our no to mean no. And so this kind of applies to things in work and things in relationship. Number 3, give honesty a seat at the table, especially in the work environments that we work in. I think sometimes, especially as leaders, we don't even know that we can lead other people into honesty. In running more love letters, I have a team of 8 individuals. And there was one situation where I knew we had to have an honest conversation. There was something that wasn't working on the team, and I was dreading it. I was like, can I beat around the bush? Can I not bring it up? Because I was afraid that if I brought it up, then everything would just fall to pieces and we wouldn't come up with a solution for it. But I chose to lead with honesty. I gave honesty a seat at the table because I don't know if my team members knew that this was a place that we could be honest with one another. And the most beautiful thing happened, like things didn't fall to pieces. Actually, solutions came from it. Breakthrough came from it. We became better because we were willing to show up at the table and work through the problem and work through the situation. And so I think a lot of times where we're thinking, okay, I can't be honest about that, we're just fearful of what it would look like to move forward in that honesty. And we might be missing the breakthrough and the growth that comes from being willing to say, hey, this isn't working. Or, hey, this isn't happening the way we thought it would. Or, hey, maybe this thing needs to we got to quit this thing and we need to try something else. No, I'm not telling you to run into your boss's office and be like, okay, we're going to have an honesty hour right now. That might not be the best thing. I don't want to be responsible for somebody getting fired today. But I am saying that if we lead with honesty, other people will then be able to see that's somebody that I can be honest with. That's somebody that I could be real with. And it is so refreshing to be surrounded by people who are willing to be real. Well, there was a quote that basically said that if we choose to be more honest about the world around us, then we could do something about it rather than passively complain about it. And I thought that hit me in the gut. And I thought we could apply that to everything, the companies that we lead in, especially the employees that we might work with or the people that we might lead. Let's choose to be honest about the reality of what's happening in this company because we don't need to give people the reason to passively complain about it. We need to be here and in a team, and that starts with honesty. And then the 4th thing, host your own honesty hour. I thought that this was really great that everybody had coffee and it was raining outside and it's so cozy in here, and I'm like, this is my ideal honesty hour. I'm not telling you need to plan an event on Facebook and get everybody around the table and have really honest conversations, but I also am telling you that if you do choose to do that, some awesome things might happen. When my book came out in May, I was like, I don't want to do a book tour. I want to do something sustainable. I want to do something that other people can get something from. I want to mobilize leaders. And so what we chose to do is we chose to put the idea of honesty out there. And we're like, let's just see what people will do with it if we tell them to host an event with people in their city that they don't know and have really honest conversations, right? Some of you are like, that's terrifying. I would never go to that. Well, the results of it were really beautiful. There were people meeting up all over the country, all over Canada, all over the world, having honest conversations. We gave them a brief manual that was like, hey, talk about some of these topics and just go to town with it. I think that would be really terrifying to be one of the 2 people that showed up at the table. I don't know about you, but if it was just one person there, I'd be like, oh gosh, I can't do this. But those girls actually ended up becoming friends, which is awesome. This is a bigger group that showed up. This was in the Carolinas. This is another group. I think they're in a Barnes & Noble, so they all didn't buy my book. They're just in the Barnes & Noble with the book. This is the DC Honesty Hour right here. And it's really crazy because we got to see the feedback from people that are like, oh my gosh, I made a lifelong friend. Or I'm connecting with this person and we're going out to coffee. That's my assistant, Claire, right there. And I've sent her on so many dates with friends and people that I think she should go hang out with. And she's built a community base in DC. But this is what everybody said. They said the hardest was just deciding to show up, right? Some of you probably felt that this morning, like, I could sleep in. The rain is so picturesque right now. Like, I don't need to come here and talk about honesty. But if this is what everybody said was the hardest part, then maybe we could get over that hurdle together. Maybe we could just show up to it. And showing up might just mean that we show up for the first 5 minutes, and that's enough. That's okay. And so I want to leave you guys with a challenge today, because I like to challenge and give action steps. It's a simple question, but it's also kind of a little complicated and hard. Where in my life do I need to have an honesty conversation? Where in your own life do you need to have an honesty hour? That might look like somebody at work. That might look like somebody that you're in a relationship with. That might look like a friendship. That might look like you going and grabbing a coffee and having an honesty hour with yourself. That you're like, hey, like, I don't know how we got this far, but this is a little off the beaten path of where I thought that we were going, so like, let's have an honesty hour and get back on the same page. We still have like 70 days left in the year, guys, so like, we can do some stuff. But I will say that these honest conversations are really important, because if we just beat around the bush, and if we don't get real and we don't get honest with one another, we risk losing one another. We risk having a friendship there one day and not the next, or having a relationship there one day and not the next. That if we could face each other at the table and say, let's just talk through this thing, let's just pull back the curtain and be real with one another, beautiful things could happen and beautiful things could be sustained. So I believe that Blake is coming up here for some questions. And this is the information if you guys want to write some love letters, moreloveletters.com. We've got requests all the time for you to get involved in.
Let's give Hannah a round of applause. Thank you.